Hello everyone, welcome to our next training video looking at Micah chapter 4, and I'd encourage you before you continue to read the chapter for yourself and to pray for God's leading and guidance as we consider this incredible chapter. But just a reminder of the context, if you've forgotten, if you want to know what's going on behind the scenes, remember 2 Kings 18 to 20. And again, we're now in the middle of the second cycle of judgment and hope in chapter 4. And chapter 4 and 5 actually is the longest section where Micah proclaims hope. Of course, Judah is the audience. Internally, one of the big things you need to remember is that King Hezekiah, although he did some good, he's aligned himself with Babylon and Egypt, which was a massive mistake, trusting in men and not in God. The injustices, like we discovered in Micah chapter 3, persisted. Of course, Micah will eventually listen in this time, as Jeremiah reminds us, and we can see that in 2 Kings. But because of his alliance with Babylon and Egypt, it was devastating for the people of Israel, devastating for Judah. The Assyrian Empire basically conquered all of Judah, crushed Babylon and Egypt, and now Jerusalem is surrounded. But getting into our passage, the first thing that Micah does, of course, in chapters 3, verse 12, Micah told us, "Therefore, because of you, Zion, you shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the Lord, or the mountain of the house, a wooded height." So destruction is foretold. And yet, after the oracle of judgment, which is chapter 3, we have this vision of hope of the new Jerusalem. But notice very importantly, and this will be highlighted in this pink-purple the whole time, is the time. In the last days. Keep that in mind. In the last days, although we've just discovered in chapter 3, verse 12, that Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, God is going to do something in the last days. The mountain of the Lord's temple will be established. It will be reestablished as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills. And then, because it's exalted, peoples, nations will stream to it. Many nations will come to it and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion." So whereas destruction has been proclaimed, there's a future hope that God's temple and city, the temple which is the place of his presence, and his law which reveals his rule on earth, will be reestablished. And because it will be reestablished, it will be exalted. People will stream to it. Nations will come. It will be like the end of exile, the end of the scattering of the nations from Babel in Genesis chapter 11. And remember that God's presence, the temple is described as a river of life in the book of Ezekiel. The law is described as a stream of life in Psalm 1. God's life-giving presence will flow forth, and nations will come to him, the mountain of the Lord, the temple of the God of Israel, and God himself will personally teach them from there, but his law will go out from there to the nations. It's an incredible vision of the new Jerusalem. And the impact of God's presence and rule going from Zion to the nations will be incredible. He will judge between many peoples, and notice the result, and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares. Rather than using what they have for warfare, they will use it to cultivate, as God originally created us way back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27. Their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. So, interesting enough about this vision, notice what is going to happen in the future when God establishes Zion. There will be peace. People will have their own food and their own land. Peace, land, bread, if I can summarize it that way. And God will establish this, no one else. It's very important to realize that King Sennacherib at this time, when you go read 2 Kings, and actually every single subsequent empire promises peace, land, and bread. Every government almost promises it, And usually human governments, like Micah chapter 3, they don't deliver. In fact, they do the opposite. They cause war. They cause dispossession. They cause famine. Only God, when He establishes Zion, He establishes His kingdom, and His presence and rule goes out into the earth, will true peace, true wholeness be established. But in the meantime, all nations may walk in the name of their gods. So this vision has not yet been fully realized. The nations still walk among their gods, but here at least Micah and the remnant declare, we will walk in the name of the Lord of our God forever and ever. And so there's a tension here between a now and a not yet in verse 5. Keep that in mind for future reference. But from here, the vision of the New Jerusalem, the next question probably would be asked, how will that happen? At the moment, they're currently under siege. How on earth will this exalted New Jerusalem and Temple, Mount Zion, be established? Well, what follows is verses 6 to 10, which is the vision of exile. But it begins with a sense of comfort, the shepherd king gathering sheep. The image is clear. In that day, still linked with the last days, declares the Lord, I will gather the lame. Notice it's God who will personally do this. I will gather the lame. I will assemble the exiles, which, by the way, implies they're going in exile. And those who I have brought to grief, I will make the lame my remnant, and those driven away a strong nation. The Lord will rule over them in Mount Zion, that day, in the last days, and forever. So notice, the promises to Abraham of making them a great nation, and as we've seen here, that will bless the nations, establish heaven on earth, a new Eden. God has not failed these promises, and He won't fail these promises. He will accomplish it through the remnant. He will gather His people again, and the crown will return to His people. But God Himself will rule personally as the shepherd king. Now keep that image in mind. But before then, as for you, watchtower flock, stronghold daughter Zion, the former dominion will be restored to you. Again, that promise of rulership will come back. Kingship will come to the daughter of Jerusalem. For now, Hezekiah's crown is broken. He's literally only ruling Jerusalem. And later on, of course, under Babylon, they'll be bereft of all rulership. But there's a promise that dominion will be restored. The promises to David will not fail. But for now, in this time, before the last days, Micah prophesies, why do you now cry aloud? Have you no king? Has your ruler perished, that pain seizes you like that of a woman in labor? Remember that the false teachers supported the wicked rulers of their day who basically cannibalized their people, and the kings who supported them, and in the end they will fail. They will writhe in agony, daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you must leave this city. This city will be a ruin. To camp in the open field, there will be no more protection in the ruined city. You will be in the open field. You'll be sent out into exile because you will go to Babylon. Now this is very important. So notice, the vision of the New Jerusalem, this vision, God is not going to ignore Israel's and Judah's idolatry and sin. God is not going to sweep under the rug the corruption of the leaders and teachers of their day. No, God will judge sin. They will go into exile. We might take our sin and idolatry lightly, but God does not. He will punish sin. And so the restoration, this New Jerusalem, will only take place when the old Jerusalem has paid for its sins, when it goes into exile. But then, once that has taken place, there you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you out of the hand of your enemies. There is hope after judgment. There is redemption, salvation after judgment. So exile must happen first. But what about the current situation? This talks about Babylon. What about Assyria? And that's where the final portrait comes in, the vision of victory. But now, again, speaking of the present time, many nations are gathered against you, Assyria and its vassal states. They've got one purpose: let her be defiled, Let our eyes gloat over Zion. But God has a hidden purpose. But they do not know why they're gathering in the end the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan. The reason Assyria and the nations are gathered at this moment is so that they would be judged themselves, that he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor, a common image of judgment. Assyria might be gathering thinking they will defile Jerusalem and gloat over Zion, destroy it, but in the end, them gathering against God's city and people will be their destruction. God will judge them, and then in the end, God calls Israel to respond. Or the people, the remnant of Judah, to respond who are trapped in Jerusalem, to join him in his victory. And so in many ways, this will be the end of the nations. The nations, if I can put it that way, coming back to this portrait, the nations who at this present moment are walking in the name of their gods. There will come a day when God will end all wickedness. And currently, what God will do with Assyria in this moment is a picture of that future judgment. And of course, this prophecy is partially fulfilled in the days of King Hezekiah and Micah and Isaiah when God strikes or struck Assyria's army. You can read about it in 2 Kings. But Judah still went into exile. They still went to Babylon. It did not prevent the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile to Babylon, and that they would be weeping, that they would be writhing in agony. So the question is, when will the exile end? When will it happen that A, the New Jerusalem will be established, this incredible vision, and there will be complete victory over idolatrous, rebellious, evil nations, and those who are in opposition to God and his people, the New Jerusalem? Well, that's where the New Testament fills in the details, and it's all tied to Jesus. He is the missing puzzle piece that helps us to understand this vision of Micah. And here are a couple of highlights for us. In the Gospels, and John's Gospel is very helpful, it's important to see that all the imagery that we saw, Jesus ties all this imagery to himself. He describes himself as the tabernacle and temple, God's presence dwelling among us. He is the light of the world. The law is described as a lamp to my feet, but the purpose of the law is fulfilled in Jesus himself, who will be the light of the world. He, in fact, is the tree of life. The tree of life that we read, the vine. Way back in Genesis chapter 2, in the Psalm 1, that describes the law even as a tree bearing fruit. Here Jesus says, I am that vine. The temple in God's presence is described as streams of living water flowing in Ezekiel. And the law that's described the same, Jesus ties that to himself. He is the spring of eternal life. He is, in Micah's vision, the good shepherd that will be gathering his sheep. And so what you need to see as Jesus spoke, this is chapter 4 by the way, as Jesus spoke to the woman at the well, is that the fulfillment of Micah's vision will not be in Jerusalem or Zion, the physical places, but these visions find their fulfillment in him. All these things are shadows pointing to Jesus, who is the reality, and it's when he is lifted up, as he proclaims that the prince of this world will be defeated and the nations will be drawn in. But it will happen with Jesus laying down his life for the sheep, him going into exile in their place, him being plowed like a field on the cross. That is part of him being lifted up. And just like Micah's vision, where the prince of this world and the nations conspired against Jesus, Acts chapter 4, crucifying him, saying, let us defile him. It'll actually be the moment when God accomplishes his greatest triumph over sin, death, and the devil, evil, this world. At the foot of the cross, through Jesus' death and resurrection, and ultimately when he is exalted, lifted up. And what we are experiencing at this moment is the age of Jesus and his church, the last days. Jesus is now exalted to the highest, to the right hand of God the Father, and he has sent his Spirit. and made the church his spirit-filled witness. We are streams. We have the streams of living water in us, as John's Gospel will explain. Remember John 14 to 17? And we, the church, are taking God's presence and word to the nations, from Zion to the nations. This is the last days. It is through the church that the exalted Jesus is gathering his people from all nations. We are seeing the fulfillment of this vision. And as citizens of the New Jerusalem, we are called to live in line with the principles of unity, love, and peace that embody Jesus' rule and kingdom. What it means to be a citizen of the New Jerusalem. This is the age we're living in, the age where we're calling people to come to Jesus, God's temple and tabernacle, and also to experience his life-giving presence and to be transformed by his word. But one day, that age where there are two cities, if I can put it that way, the city of men that still worships idols and functions in the old way of sin and rebellion, and at this moment, those who are citizens of the New Jerusalem, living in line of unity, love, and peace, as Jesus teaches us from his word by his Spirit, that age will come to an end when Jesus returns. The New Jerusalem will be established when he returns. The fullness of this vision will be realized, and the city and kingdoms of men, built on idolatry and corruption, like Babylon, like the old Jerusalem, they will be destroyed. And in that moment, the fullness of the vision of Micah will be fulfilled. So what do we want people to walk away with? Importantly, see how Jesus fulfills the prophetic hope of Micah, but also see and be challenged in our role in the last days. We are the ones going out to the nations calling them to come, but also to be encouraged by our future hope. The cross and the resurrection of Jesus is a mini picture of what God will do at the end of all things. Victory is assured. The establishment of the New Jerusalem guaranteed. Our King is exalted. His kingdom will be established. And so we should be encouraged and keep going, knowing our future hope is secure. And that is what we want people to walk away with from Micah chapter 4.